Microservices are a bit of a hot topic right now. AWS, or at least AWS Prime Video, I believe, has essentially dropped their microservices approach, and that's interesting considering it's AWS, essentially the purveyors or the beginners of the microservice architecture approach in the modern era. And plenty of people had plenty of opinions on this. Now, I will say, without giving too many hot takes because I haven't read all of the blog posts about it, basically it seems like everybody's blowing this up into AWS has given up on microservice architecture, when in reality it's just Prime Video, or at least like the video part of AWS has given up microservice infrastructure for a monoservice approach. And I've seen several different hot takes that essentially said that makes sense considering the workloads that video processing has to go through. But several different people had several different opinions, and it's just kind of been the hot topic of the time right now. I wanted to reel back because I saw a lot of people not necessarily understanding what the microservice architecture is all about and how it works within AWS. I wanted to kind of back up a little bit and talk about what microservice architecture even is. Now, I'm a fairly big time noob when it comes to all of like the microservice architecture stuff. I've only been doing it for like the last 6 months to a year now. So there's still a lot that I don't know, that I don't understand. A lot of the quirks and perks and downfalls of the microservice architecture versus the monoservice architecture, I don't necessarily understand perfectly. So I'm probably going to make mistakes in this video. This is more a discussion from my kind of experience with microservice architecture and less of a overarching like professional view on it. So microservices versus monoservices. When you write a code base that does everything that you need it to do, you are functionally working on a monoservice. You might throw that up on DigitalOcean, for example, on a VPS on DigitalOcean, and have a REST API around it that does everything that you need the app to do. If you're really scaling up, you might have load balancers and fun things like that that route requests to different versions or different copies of this monoservice. But functionally, what you're doing is you are writing one application that goes on one or more servers that does all of the things that you need it to do. This is a fairly typical, fairly like simplistic approach to monoservices. I'm not covering all of the different edge cases. I'm not covering the definition of monoservice perfectly, but that's essentially what it is. A microservice approach instead takes all of the different things that you want your code base to do and breaks them up into their own services. Those services are usually on some kind of microservice like hosted architecture like Lambda. That's the one that I'm the most familiar with. That basically allows you to break everything out into what are called Lambda functions. Lambda functions are basically atomic pieces of code that have triggers that will process data or do a thing and will then return something or finish that action. It only runs one time when you call it, versus a monoservice that stays hosted even if it's completely dormant the entire time. Now, you can probably immediately see a potential benefit to a microservice approach. Microservices are billed by the hour in which they are running. So if your microservice only runs for half a second per day, you're only going to get billed for that half a second per day. So this can really drastically decrease costs if you're not running your Lambda function or your microservice very frequently. If your Lambda or your microservice is incredibly fast and it only runs for a very short period of time, you can save tons of money. What AWS said was that their microservice approach was actually costing them tons of money, and they were actually able to slash their budget by like 90% by switching over to a monoservice approach. Now, I haven't read the blogs. Again, I'm not just a complete guru or an expert on the discussion that's going on right now around it. But what this might mean is that they had designed their microservices in such a way, or their microservices had requirements that required them to essentially be running constantly. If your service is running constantly, then you're probably going to be billed more for that microservice than you would if you just ran it as a monoservice that runs constantly. A monoservice is billed by the month, no matter how much you use it usually. I believe DigitalOcean has some like limits on, basically like the like network in, network out, that they might bill you a little bit more for that. But functionally, the main bit of your billing is a flat fee that you pay every single month or every week or every day for that service to run, even if it's dormant. Now, if that service is running constantly, you are probably going to save money by making it a monoservice that runs constantly versus a microservice that runs when it's called. That said, there are other costs and benefits to the microservice versus the monoservice approach. Microservices can get ridiculously complicated. If you have atomic functions that all interact with each other, that all interact with different REST APIs, that all do different things, you have to orchestrate those. All of those microservices are going to be talking to each other in complex ways. And you can create a ton of different edge cases where this microservice might error out in a really unique way and then speak to that microservice and return that error in a way that that microservice can't handle. And then that failure cascades upwards. And then you've got tons of functions that are all failing, and you have to hunt through the logs to find out which microservice failed first. Whereas with the monoservice, the thing just fails. And you can hunt through those logs on that one service or that one server and figure out where it failed. You also have your entire code base normally, or at least a lot of your code base in front of you with a monoservice approach. So you don't have to keep hunting through different lambdas. I write my lambdas, for example, in Golang. So with Golang, you're delivering a compiled executable to AWS, and it pulls that and it runs it whenever it's called. The reason why I mention that is that you cannot view the code on AWS's console if you use a compiled binary, because all it has is the compiled binary. It's not going to decompile that for you. So I have to hunt through my code bases to find where the logs on AWS correlate to where my log function or my log statements are in my code base. It gets really, really complicated. That said, with my kind of applications, I save a ton of money and a bit of time by approaching this from a microservice kind of approach. That said, AWS obviously had different ideas, or AWS Video at least had different ideas, or they had a different approach that allowed them to save a ton of money. Really what I'm saying here is that a lot of the discussions are centered around one way being the best way in all circumstances possible. That is the way the dev community and the cybersecurity community loves to talk about complicated issues. Everything has got to be one way or the other. It's all binary, black or white. That's not really how things work. With AWS Video, they obviously found a way to save a ton of money, which probably isn't going to be passed down to the consumer anytime soon, but they found a way to save a ton of money by switching to a monoservice approach. Me personally, I know for a fact that I'm going to save a ton of money, at least in the short term, by keeping to this microservice approach that I've got for my cybersecurity startup Grabber app. So the point that I'm trying to make here is there is no black and white. There are different methods or different software development methodologies that are going to do well in certain environments versus others. The microservice approach took the world by storm, and everybody thought that everything needed to be a Lambda. And as AWS is showing, and as a lot of other people have shown, that may not exactly be the case. It may be the case that a good old monoservice repo is still the way to go. So when you're developing out your projects, check it out, look into the billing, look into the way that your service is going to run, and basically decide for yourself. Figure out exactly how you need to architect your projects in a way that is both cost effective and efficient in the way that it runs. That's about it, guys. Take it easy. Peace.